I'm Anastasia Chatzka, a fashion designer with over 20 years of experience and a sewing educator. And I'm really excited you're here to share another sewing adventure with me today. Welcome to Sewing Anastasia, and today I'm going to show you how to sew bias binding on a V-neck of a dress. Sewing a V with bias binding can be super tricky because it's going to get all bubbly. So what do you do to make that V point in bias binding? Well, follow along and I am going to show you how to make a V point with the bias binding. If you're not already a subscriber to Sewing Anastasia, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when all the new videos come out. Also, I'm now teaching virtual sewing lessons and sewing lessons in person, so if you'd like to sign up for those, make sure you go to sewinganastasia.com or click that link down below. We're going to be using a double fold bias binding for the neckline, so make sure you grab some double fold bias binding and cut it a little longer than the length of your neckline. So I'm just going to roughly measure how much binding I need for the neckline, give myself a little bit of extra, and cut. Now that we have our binding cut, we're going to go ahead and pin it to the wrong side of the fabric. If you need help with how to sew bias binding, make sure you check out my video. So I have the wrong side of my bodice face up, and now I'm going to unfold my double fold bias binding, and I'm going to place the right side of it right next to the raw edge. We're going to go ahead and pin this just like we normally would when we're creating a bias bound neckline. Okay, but now we've got that point. What do we do? Well, it's real easy. All we're gonna do is straighten it out. We're gonna pretend like it's not even there and it doesn't exist. So notice how I'm just pulling it straight across the bias binding. Now when we sew this, it's going to be a little tricky, so we've got some pointers for that. But right now, you just want to keep it straight along the bias binding. Okay, so this is the inside of my dress right now. This is the V point of the neck. And now when I flip it out to the right side, you can see how we just have the pins. So we're going to sew in the first crease of the binding on the sewing machine. So let's go over to the sewing machine and sew it down. So I'm going to line up my foot so that way my stitches are going to stitch right in that crease. Make sure you backstitch. Also, make sure you take out your pins before you get to them. Okay, so our V point is coming up. So you'll notice I'm going to straighten out my fabric. It's creating these folds here, and that's totally okay. So we just want to make sure that when we're coming across where the point is right here, that we don't have any folds of fabric. As long as we're keeping this area straight and everything lined up, it's going to work out. Sew a little, adjust your fabric, make sure it's flat. And just keep taking out your pins as you get to them. Backstitch at the end and cut. Okay, so let's check out how it's looking so far. So right now, this is the outside of my garment, the right side. And if we take it and flip it to the inside of the garment, right now it's looking like that. So now what we want to do is take our binding and fold it to the front of our garment and put some pins in it, so that way we can edge stitch right next to the edge of the binding. And you're probably wondering, well, my neckline is going to be curved and funny looking. And at this point, don't worry if your neckline is looking curved and funny, it's going to. We are going to trick it into being a point later. So right now, let's just pin the edge of our binding down. When you're folding the binding over, you want to make sure that it's covering that line of stitches there, so that way we don't see it on the outside of our garment. It's looking great. So now we're gonna go over to the sewing machine and we are gonna sew on the very edge of the binding. So when we're doing the stitch, make sure you're all the way on the edge of the binding and make sure you can't see that stitch that's under the binding as well. Make sure you backstitch. Remove your pins as you get to them. For right now, you want to just make sure your binding is nice and straight. So my V point is technically right here at the center of my dress. Right now, I'm going to keep it nice and straight. And just work my way around the neckline. Back stitch and cut. Now that we have the binding sewn on, we need to create the V at the center front of the bodice. So let's do it. So notice we have the binding on. It looks really nice, but it's doing this weird thing at the front. Now we need to take this weird bubbly shape and turn it into a V. So you're wondering, how are we going to do that? We're gonna fold right sides together, line up your bodice so you know where your center front is. And notice how this little piece of binding is poking out over here. We essentially want to get rid of that. What we want to do is sew straight up from center front. We're basically creating this little dart at center front. Now you can see I have this line going from center front of the bodice all the way up. So where this white line is, we need to sew. And once we sew that, we're going to get a nice V at center front. So let's sew that V up and check out our V neckline. Let's sew up where I chalked. Make sure you backstitch. Backstitch at the bottom and cut. The magic has happened, so let's check it out close up. The inside of the binding is gonna look like this with this little notch. You can see where we sewed down. And now if we flip it to the right side, you can see we have a beautiful V. And all we need to do is go ahead, hit it with a little iron, and we are good to go. Remember how curvy that was? And now we have a beautiful V in our bodice. So I gave it a little iron and flattened it out, and it's looking and laying beautifully. Thanks so much for watching Sewing Anastasia today. If you have any questions on how to sew a V-neck with bias binding, let me know, leave it down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and I would love to know what you thought of the video, so leave it down below in the comments. I'm now teaching virtual sewing lessons and sewing lessons in person, and you can find information on that at sewinganastasia.com, or down below, there's a link you can click on. Also, make sure you follow me at Sewing Anastasia on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and Pinterest and all those fabulous social media websites, so that way we can stay connected and inspiring each other. Also, if you want to help grow Sewing Anastasia, hop on over to Patreon. Even just $1 a month helps us. It keeps us sewing, growing, and going. If you're not already a subscriber to Sewing Anastasia, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when all the new videos come out. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!